I'm dying in a hospice bed in Port Angeles, and I need to confess to 35 years of federal crimes I committed to protect a family that isn't supposed to exist. My name is Robert Hensley. I'm 71 years old, a retired park ranger from Olympic National Park in Washington State, and the morphine drip next to me says I've got maybe a week left. My granddaughter Emma is sitting across from me right now, holding a digital recorder because I asked her to. She thinks I'm rambling, that the cancer has spread to my brain. But every word I'm about to tell her is true, and when I'm gone, she'll have proof. What I did was illegal. What I witnessed was impossible. And what the government has been doing in our national parks for the past 50 years is something the American people deserve to know. It started in July of 1989. I was 36 years old, 8 years into my career as a ranger, and I'd just finalized a bitter divorce that left me with nothing but my work and a cabin on the edge of the park. I was good at my job, maybe too good. I knew every trail, every watershed, every square mile of the Hoh rainforest section like it was my own backyard. The forest was more home to me than any house had ever been. On July 23, 1989, I got a call around 2 in the afternoon about a missing hiker. A 24-year-old geology student from Seattle named Marcus Chen had failed to check in at the ranger station after a 3-day solo camping trip. His vehicle was still in the trailhead parking lot, his itinerary filed properly, but he was now 6 hours overdue. Standard protocol. I grabbed my pack, radioed my position, and headed out. The July air was thick with the smell of cedar and sword ferns. Shafts of sunlight cut through the cathedral canopy of Sitka spruce and Douglas fir, some of those trees over 500 years old. The trail was well maintained for the first 3 miles, but Chen's itinerary had him camping in a more remote area near the Hoh River tributary. The deeper I went, the more the forest changed. The undergrowth became denser, the moss hung heavier, and the sounds of other hikers faded entirely until there was nothing but the whisper of wind through needles and the distant rush of water. I found Chen's campsite around 4:30. The tent was shredded, not torn open like a bear would do, but methodically pulled apart as if something had been searching through it. His gear was scattered across a 20-foot radius. Sleeping bag in the bushes, cooking equipment overturned, backpack contents strewn everywhere. But here's what stopped me cold. No blood, not a drop. No signs of struggle in the dirt, no defensive wounds on the tent fabric. Nothing that suggested violence. Just deliberate, careful destruction. Then I saw the drag marks. 2 parallel lines in the soft earth, each about 6 inches wide, leading away from the campsite deeper into the restricted area. They weren't animal tracks, they weren't boot prints. They were something else entirely. Something that moved with enough weight to compress the moss and ferns, but with a stride length that seemed impossible. I measured later. 8 feet between impressions. I followed those marks for 2 miles, my heart hammering harder with every step. The forest around me had gone completely silent. No birds, no insects, nothing. Just that oppressive quiet that makes your ears ring. I'd learned in my training that predators create silence. Every small creature goes still when something dangerous is near. The trail led me to a small clearing near a creek I'd never seen on any park map. And there, laid out carefully on a bed of fresh ferns next to the water, was Marcus Chen. He was unconscious but breathing, his leg bent at an unnatural angle. Someone or something had carried him here, positioned him in recovery position, and left him near fresh water. That's when I looked up and saw it. 40 yards away, partially obscured by a massive cedar trunk, stood a figure that made my training, my experience, my entire understanding of wildlife biology completely irrelevant. It was at least 9 feet tall, covered in dark, reddish-brown hair that caught the filtered sunlight. Shoulders broader than any human, broader than any bear. It stood upright on 2 legs with a posture that was disturbingly human-like. And it was watching me. We locked eyes. I don't know how long we stood there, 30 seconds, a minute. Time seemed to stop. The creature's face was flat, almost human, but not quite. Dark eyes that reflected intelligence, not animal instinct. It didn't move aggressively. It simply observed me, as if evaluating whether I understood what I was seeing. Then it did something that changed everything. It deliberately stepped backward into the shadows, moving with impossible fluidity for something so massive. It didn't run, it didn't threaten, it retreated, giving me space to help the injured hiker, and in that moment I understood it had saved Marcus Chen. It had carried him to safety, positioned him for rescue, and then waited nearby to make sure help arrived. I radioed for medevac immediately, my hands shaking so badly I could barely key the microphone. The helicopter extracted Chen within 40 minutes. Broken femur, severe hypothermia, no memory of anything after the first night. The official report said he'd fallen, crawled to the creek, and passed out. Everyone accepted that explanation. But I went back the next day. I had to know. I hiked back to that clearing and found territorial markers I'd missed before. Stacks of stones arranged in deliberate patterns. Young saplings bent and woven together in ways that couldn't be natural. And then I found something that made my blood run cold. Government survey markers. Aluminum stakes driven into the ground, stamped with USGS classified and 8-digit coordinate codes. They formed a perimeter around the area, maybe a quarter-mile radius. This wasn't geological survey work. This was something else. Near the creek bank, I found a partial boot print in the mud. Military-style tread, size 11, and half buried in the moss, a tranquilizer dart. The kind used for large game animals, but modified. The dose indicator on the side read numbers that would drop a grizzly bear in seconds. When I got back to the ranger station, my supervisor, a grizzled veteran named Dale Warren, pulled me aside before I could even file my report. He was in his late 50s, 28 years with the Park Service, and he looked at me with an expression I'd never seen before. Fear mixed with resignation. "What did you see out there, Rob?" he asked quietly, closing his office door. I opened my mouth to tell him everything, but something in his eyes stopped me. He already knew, or at least he suspected. "Just helped extract an injured hiker," I said carefully. "Found some unusual tracks, might be a large bear." Dale studied my face for a long moment. "Ah, some areas of this park aren't on the official maps for a reason, son. There are things the Park Service doesn't talk about. Projects that ran in the 70s that got shut down real quiet. Researchers who asked too many questions and got reassigned to Alaska or Arizona. You understand what I'm saying?" I nodded slowly. "Don't go looking for answers." "Smart man." Dale handed me a blank incident report form. "Write up the hiker extraction. Leave out anything that doesn't fit the standard narrative. Trust me on this." That night, I couldn't sleep. I drove to the public library in Port Angeles and spent 4 hours going through newspaper archives on microfiche. I found it buried in the August 1974 editions. A small article about the Olympic Wilderness Research Project. 3 researchers from an unnamed federal agency had died in the park under mysterious circumstances. The project was immediately terminated. No further details provided. The article mentioned Dr. Sarah Vickers, lead researcher, but when I searched her name, nothing came up. It was like she'd been erased. I went home as the sun rose over the Olympic Mountains, my mind racing with implications I didn't want to accept. That creature hadn't just saved Marcus Chen. It had been trying to communicate something. A warning, maybe, or a plea. I didn't know it then, but that July morning would define the next 35 years of my life. The creature I'd seen, the one that lived in the shadows of Sector 7, would become the center of everything. I would learn its story, meet its family, and eventually sacrifice my career, my relationships, and my freedom to protect them. Because over those decades, I would discover the truth. The government knew Bigfoot existed. They'd been hunting them for half a century. And I was about to become the only thing standing between a family of intelligent beings and their extinction. I started calling it Sector 7 in my personal logbook. No official designation, just my own private code for the 5 squares, miles of Olympic National Park where I'd seen the impossible. For the next 18 months, I changed my patrol patterns without telling anyone. I'd volunteer for the remote assignments nobody else wanted, the multi-day solo treks into areas where cell service disappeared and radio only worked if you climbed to a ridgeline. Dale never questioned it. I think he was relieved someone else was willing to take those routes. The sightings came slowly at first. A glimpse of movement through old-growth timber that was too tall, too deliberate to be a bear. Massive footprints in streamside mud that I'd photograph, measure, then carefully obscure before hiking out. The prints were consistently 17 to 19 inches long, 7 inches across at the ball, with a stride length that varied between 6 and 8 feet depending on terrain. I documented everything in a journal I kept locked in my truck, never in official reports. By winter of 1990, I'd established a pattern. Every third patrol into Sector 7, I'd leave something behind. At first, it was just food I could claim as lost or consumed. A salmon I'd caught in the Ho River, left on a flat rock near where I'd found those territorial markers. Apples from my lunch. Once, the entire jar of honey I'd bought specifically for this purpose. I'd mark the locations in my journal with coordinates, then check them on my next patrol. The offerings were always gone, and in their place, I'd find things. A perfect eagle feather positioned exactly where I'd left the salmon. River stones stacked in small cairns. Once, an obsidian arrowhead so old it had to be prehistoric, placed carefully on the rock where I'd left the honey jar. Something was accepting my gifts and reciprocating. Something that understood the concept of trade. The direct encounter happened on a morning in late April 1991. I'd camped overnight near the Ho River tributary, a practice I'd started doing once a month. The dawn came slow through the canopy, filtered light painting everything in shades of green and gold. I was crouched by the river, filling my canteen, when I heard the snap of a branch behind me. Not the random crack of forest settling, but the deliberate sound of weight being placed. I turned slowly, keeping my movements calm and non-threatening. And there he was, less than 15 feet away, fully visible in the morning light. The same creature from that first day, I was certain of it. The reddish-brown fur, the massive frame, the intelligent eyes that tracked my every movement. He was even larger than I'd estimated before. 9 feet tall easily, maybe more. Shoulders that had to be 4 feet across. Hands that could palm a basketball like I'd palm an orange. We stared at each other across that impossible distance. My heart was hammering so hard I could feel it in my throat, but I forced myself to stay still. He took one step closer, then another. I could see the texture of his fur now, coarser on the shoulders, finer on the face, Could see the way his chest expanded with each breath. Could see the calluses on his palms from a lifetime of moving through rough terrain. Then he did something that shattered every assumption I'd built. He raised his right hand, fingers spread, and held it there. Palm facing me. Not a threat, an offer. I'd seen enough primate behavior documentation to recognize a peace gesture when I saw one. Slowly, barely breathing, I raised my own hand in mirror image. He made a sound. Not the deep vocalization I'd read about in Bigfoot reports, but something softer, almost questioning. Then he pointed to the forest around us with a sweeping gesture. His hand came to rest on his own chest. The message was clear even without language. This place, me, home. I touched the nearest cedar trunk, then placed my hand over my own heart, copying his gesture. Understanding passed between us in that moment, something primal that predated words. I was acknowledging his claim, his territory, his right to exist in this place. He watched me for another long moment, then did something that made my throat tighten. He reached down and picked up a large rock from the riverbank. With movements that were surprisingly delicate for hands that size, he placed it on a fallen log between us. Then he stepped back, waiting. I understood. My turn. I pulled an apple from my pack and placed it next to his rock. He made that soft sound again, picked up the apple and examined it with what looked like genuine curiosity, brought it to his nose, smelled it, turned it over in his massive hands. Then he looked at me, and I could have sworn he was trying to smile. The expression didn't quite work on that face, but the intent was there. Over the following months, this became our routine. I'd hike into Sector 7, and more often than not, he'd appear. Sometimes from a distance, observing. Other times, close enough that I could have reached out and touched him, though I never did. That boundary felt sacred, something that shouldn't be crossed even as trust built between us. I started thinking of him as guardian. Never said the name aloud, but it fit. He was protecting something in this forest, and he was deciding whether I could be trusted with that knowledge. By summer of 1992, Guardian made his decision. I was sitting on a moss-covered log, eating my lunch, when he emerged from the tree line with two others behind him. My breath caught. A female, smaller than Guardian at maybe 7 feet, with fur that was more brown than red, and an adolescent, perhaps 5.5 feet tall, staying close to the female's side. Guardian approached our usual meeting spot, but the other two hung back. The female watched me with obvious wariness, positioning herself slightly in front of the juvenile. Guardian made a series of soft vocalizations toward them, sounds I'd never heard before, almost reassuring in tone. The juvenile made a small sound in response, curiosity overcoming caution. For the next hour, sat completely still while the Guardian's family observed me from varying distances. The juvenile was the bravest, eventually coming within 20 feet to examine the remains of my sandwich I'd left on the log. The female never approached closer than 40 feet, but I could see her studying me, evaluating every movement, every gesture. I'd brought extra food that day, some instinct telling me I might need it. Dried salmon, apples, granola bars. I laid them out on the log slowly, then backed away to give them space. Guardian approached first, but instead of taking the food for himself, he gathered it up and brought it to the female and juvenile. Sharing, providing for his family. Before they left, Guardian did something new. He pointed to the female, then to the juvenile, then swept his hand to encompass both of them. Then he pointed at me and placed his hand over his heart. The message was clear. These are mine. I'm trusting you with them. I nodded, placing my own hand over my heart, a promise without words. As they disappeared back into the forest, I sat there shaking, not from fear, but from the weight of what had just happened. Guardian had introduced me to his family. In the wild, that kind of trust was profound. It meant he believed I wouldn't harm them, wouldn't betray their location, wouldn't bring danger to their doorstep. I had no idea then how much danger was already closing in. I didn't know about the motion sensor cameras being installed in grids throughout the park. Didn't know about Project Terminus and its mandate to acquire specimens at any cost. Didn't know that within 3 years, I'd have to make a choice between my oath as a federal ranger and my promise to a father trying to protect his family. But sitting there in that clearing, watching the place where they'd vanished into shadow, I knew one thing for certain. I would die before I let anything happen to them. The lies started small. A trail closure here, a bear sighting report there. Nothing that would raise immediate red flags. But by 1993, I'd become an expert at misdirection. I'd studied Guardian's territory so thoroughly that I knew every game trail, every water source, every place his family spent time. When I saw survey teams heading toward those areas, I'd intercept them. Claimed I'd spotted fresh cougar kills, reported unstable ground conditions, invented reasons to redirect people away from Sector 7. My supervisor, Dale, retired in early 1994, and his replacement was a by-the-book administrator named Patricia Mills, who didn't appreciate my territorial attitude. She called me into her office after I'd filed my 3rd consecutive report about dangerous bear activity in the same general area. "Rob, I'm concerned about your patrol patterns," she said, spreading maps across her desk. "You've been focusing heavily on this region for almost 5 years now. And frankly, some of your reports don't add up. We've had other rangers in these areas who haven't encountered any of the issues you're describing." I kept my face neutral. "I know that terrain better than anyone. I'm just being cautious." "Or territorial," she said, meeting my eyes. "There are federal survey teams that need access to those areas. Geological studies, wildlife population assessments. You can't keep finding reasons to close off 20 square miles of national park." I wanted to tell her the truth right then. Wanted to explain that those survey teams weren't who they claimed to be, but I couldn't. So I nodded, accepted her reprimand, and became more careful about how I sabotaged operations. The real problem started in the fall of 1995. I was on a routine patrol when I heard helicopters. Not the single-engine tourist flights that occasionally passed over, but military-grade choppers flying in formation. 3 of them, black with no visible markings, moving low over the canopy in a grid pattern. I hiked to a ridgeline where my radio worked and scanned frequencies until I picked up their communications. The voices were clipped, professional, using codes I didn't recognize. But I caught enough to understand. They were tracking thermal signatures, looking for large bipedal heat sources in areas where humans weren't supposed to be. My stomach dropped. They were hunting Guardian's family. I spent the next 2 days tracking those helicopters, following the sound, trying to stay ahead of whatever operation they were running. On the 3rd day, I found their ground team, 8 personnel in tactical gear, carrying tranquilizer rifles and electronic equipment. They'd set up a temporary base camp near a creek, less than 2 miles from where I'd last seen Guardian. I watched from cover as they deployed what looked like motion-triggered net launchers in the trees. Listened as their team leader briefed them on capture protocols. Juvenile target preferred. Smaller, easier to transport, better survival rate in containment. Adult specimens are secondary objectives. They were talking about Guardian's child like it was a research animal. like it was something they had the right to take. That night, I made a decision that would define everything that came after. I hiked to the ranger station, filed a false report about potential avalanche conditions in the area, and triggered an emergency evacuation order for that entire sector. It was a massive overreach of my authority, and I knew there'd be consequences. But it bought time. While the contractors were being evacuated, I found Guardian. He was already agitated, pacing near his family's shelter. He'd heard the helicopters, sensed the danger. When he saw me, he made urgent vocalizations I'd never heard before. Fear, anger, desperation. I used gestures, pointing in the direction of the threat, then pointing away, toward deeper wilderness. He understood immediately. His family needed to move. I spent the next 6 hours guiding them through the darkest, most remote terrain I knew. Places where helicopters couldn't land, where ground teams would struggle to follow. Guardian carried his juvenile on his shoulders. The female moved with purpose despite obvious exhaustion. By dawn, I'd led them to a hidden valley I'd discovered years earlier. It was off every map, accessible only through a narrow canyon that most people would never find. Guardian looked at me with something that transcended species: gratitude, trust, understanding that I'd just saved his family. When I returned to the ranger station 3 days later, I was placed on administrative leave. The fake avalanche warning had been investigated. No geological evidence supported my claims. Patricia Mills was furious. Federal contractors had filed complaints about the operation disruption. I was facing disciplinary action, possible termination, but the charges were quietly dropped after 2 weeks. No explanation given. I realized later why. They couldn't investigate too deeply without revealing what those contractors were really doing in the park. The operation I'd sabotaged wasn't supposed to exist officially. I was transferred to a different sector as punishment. They thought it would keep me away from Sector 7. Instead, it gave me a broader view of the park and helped me scout new safe territories. I used my access to guide Guardian's family deeper into wilderness, always staying one step ahead of the people hunting them. The cost to my personal life was severe. My daughter Sarah stopped returning my calls after I missed her college graduation. My second marriage fell apart when my wife found my hidden journals and thought I was having a mental breakdown. I developed ulcers from stress, stopped sleeping more than 3 or 4 hours a night. Every helicopter I heard made my heart race. But in 1997, Guardian showed me why it was all worth it. He led me on a 3-day hike into the most remote section of Olympic National Park. Through terrain so difficult I had to use climbing gear in places. And there, in a hidden valley surrounded by peaks, I saw them. 4 other family groups, maybe 20 individuals total. Adults, juveniles, even infants. They had a community, a society. They communicated with complex vocalizations, shared food, taught their young, played together in ways that looked heartbreakingly human. I watched an elderly male show a juvenile how to fish, saw 2 females grooming each other's fur with obvious care, witnessed what looked like a mourning ritual around a burial site marked with stones. These weren't animals. They were people. Different from us, but people nonetheless. Guardian stood beside me on the ridge overlooking the valley, and for the first time, I fully understood what I was protecting. This might be the last viable population of their species left anywhere, and the government knew about them, had known for decades, was actively trying to capture them for reasons I could only guess at. In the year 2000, everything escalated. New teams arrived with equipment I'd never seen before. Thermal imaging so advanced it could detect body heat through dense forest canopy. Drone technology still classified at the time. DNA collection protocols using environmental sampling. They were getting smarter, more persistent, better funded. I overheard a conversation that changed everything. Two contractors at a supply depot talking freely because they didn't know I was in earshot. One of them mentioned Project Terminus by name. Said they'd been authorized for specimen acquisition, live capture preferred, but termination was acceptable if subjects resisted. Termination. They were authorized to kill Guardian's family if capturing them proved too difficult. I confronted them directly, showed my ranger credentials and demanded to know their authorization. The lead contractor, a cold-eyed man named Fletcher, smiled at me like I was a child who'd asked a stupid question. "You're obstructing federal research, Ranger Hensley. I'd suggest you stand down before this becomes a problem for you." I stood my ground, told him those areas were closed for endangered species protection, made up regulations that didn't exist, threatened to file reports with every environmental agency I could think of. Fletcher's smile never wavered. "We know about your history here, the false reports, the convenient closures, the 1995 incident. You've been protecting them for years. That ends now." That's when Guardian appeared. He'd been watching from the tree line, probably tracking my movements like he often did. He stepped into view, massive and undeniable. Fletcher's hand went to his sidearm immediately. I moved without thinking. Stepped directly between Guardian and Fletcher's weapon. "If you want to shoot him, you'll have to shoot a federal ranger first, and you'll have to explain why to every media outlet in the country." The standoff lasted maybe 30 seconds. Fletcher's hand hovered over his weapon. Guardian stood perfectly still behind me. I could hear my own heartbeat thundering in my ears. Finally, Fletcher stepped back. "This isn't over, Hensley. You're making a mistake you'll regret." As they left, Guardian placed one enormous hand on my shoulder. Just for a moment. A gesture of thanks that carried more weight than any words could hold. But I knew Fletcher was right. This was only the beginning. They would come back with more resources, more authority, more determination. And I was just one man standing against forces I barely understood. After the confrontation with Fletcher, I became obsessed with understanding what I was really fighting against. I started using my network of ranger contacts across the Pacific Northwest, asking careful questions about unusual federal activity in their parks. A ranger in North Cascades mentioned seeing similar black helicopters. Another in Mount Rainier described finding abandoned research equipment with the same USGS classified stamps I'd seen years earlier. The pattern was bigger than I'd imagined. I spent months gathering fragments of information until I had enough to risk something dangerous. There was a ranger named Mike Chen, no relation to the hiker I'd rescued, who'd worked in Olympic before transferring to the Gifford-Pinchot National Forest. We'd stayed friendly over the years, and he'd always had a cynical view of federal agencies. Over beers one night in late 2001, I tested the waters. "You ever hear about Project Terminus?" I asked casually. Mike's expression changed immediately. He looked around the bar, then leaned in close. "Where did you hear that name?" "Contractors in the park. They mentioned it." Mike was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "I signed a non-disclosure agreement in 1998. Saw some things during a joint operation between Park Service and another agency. Things that didn't make sense until they showed me documentation. Rob, if you know that name, you're already in deeper than you should be." He wouldn't tell me more that night. But 2 weeks later, he sent me a package with no return address. Inside were photocopied documents, heavily redacted but still revealing. Project Terminus had been active since 1973. Its stated goal was to locate, study, and preserve an endangered species of North American primate. But the methods described were terrifying. Capture protocols, containment facilities, genetic sampling, behavioral modification studies. One document included a table. 7 successful captures between 1974 and 1996. Locations, dates, specimen characteristics. Every single one was listed as deceased within 3 years. Causes of death: respiratory failure, cardiac arrest, failure to thrive, self-inflicted trauma. They'd captured 7 Bigfoot over 2 decades, and all of them had died in captivity. Guardian showed me his side of this history in the spring of 2002. He led me to a cave I'd never seen before, hidden behind a waterfall in the deepest part of his territory. Inside were pictographs covering the stone walls. Some looked ancient, faded ochre and charcoal drawings showing Bigfoot and humans together, hunting side by side, sharing food, living in harmony. But the images changed as they progressed along the wall. Humans with weapons, Bigfoot running, bodies on the ground, and then, most recently, crude drawings that Guardian must have made himself. Stick figures representing humans with what looked like nets and cages. Bigfoot separated from their families. The images told a story of genocide stretching back centuries, accelerating in recent decades. Guardian used gestures to communicate what the pictures couldn't fully express. He pointed to himself, then held his hand low to the ground. Young. Then he held up both hands with all fingers spread. Many. A large family. He made walking motions, then suddenly stopped and crouched low, showing me hiding. His eyes held ancient pain as he mimed watching something terrible. He formed his hands into shapes suggesting weapons, loud noises, chaos. Then he lifted his shirt of fur and showed me scars I'd seen before but never fully understood. 3 parallel marks across his ribs. Old wounds, long healed, but the story they told was clear. He'd been shot, had watched his family killed, had survived by playing dead while humans came to examine the bodies. He showed me how many seasons had passed since that day. 10 times he gestured the cycle of weather changing. A decade of living alone with that trauma before he'd found the female and started over. Before he'd decided to trust me. I sat in that cave with tears streaming down my face, understanding finally why they hid with such determination. Why every helicopter sent them into panic. Why Guardian had been so cautious about introducing me to his family. They'd been hunted for generations. Not by individuals, but systematically, deliberately. Over the following months, I broke into contractor camps when I knew they were empty. I was risking everything, but I needed proof. On one of these incursions in late 2002, I found a laptop left unattended. I had maybe 15 minutes before the team returned. My hands shook as I copied files to a thumb drive I'd brought. What I found confirmed my worst fears. Project Terminus wasn't about preservation, it was about control. The goal was to establish a captive breeding population in a classified facility. The Bigfoot would be studied, their intelligence tested, their genetics mapped. The public would never know they existed. The species would be reduced to research subjects, living their entire lives in cages, while the government maintained official denial of their existence. The files showed 7 previous capture successes, just like the documents Mike had sent me. But they also showed something more disturbing. None of those Bigfoot had simply died. They'd stopped eating, stopped responding to stimuli, essentially willed themselves to death rather than live in captivity. The reports called it failure to adapt. I called it what it was: suicide. And now they were planning another operation. Spring of 2003, Guardian's female was pregnant. I'd noticed the behavioral changes. Guardian bringing her more food, being more protective, the slight swelling in her abdomen. The contractors had noticed too. Their notes specifically mentioned targeting a pregnant female. Better specimen for study. Opportunity to observe birth and early development in controlled setting. They were planning to take Guardian's pregnant mate and study her like a lab animal while her baby was born in a cage. I spent the next 6 months in careful preparation. I mapped every camera location in Sector 7 and the surrounding areas, documented patrol patterns of contractor teams, located their supply caches and equipment staging areas, and I waited for the right moment. The operation began on a cold March morning in 2003. I watched from a ridge as black helicopters moved into position. Ground teams deployed with capture equipment. They were using thermal imaging to track Guardian's family, herding them toward a prepared ambush site with net launchers and tranquilizer rifles. I'd prepared for this. Over the previous weeks, I'd guided Guardian's family to new territory outside the surveillance grid. When the contractor's thermal imaging showed heat signatures in the expected location, they were tracking deer I'd deliberately driven into that area. I'd created false trails, false signs, false evidence of Bigfoot activity leading away from where Guardian's family was actually hiding. While the contractors executed their operation on empty forest, I was 10 miles away helping Guardian's family cross into the most remote wilderness in the park. Territory so rugged and isolated that even experienced mountaineers rarely ventured there. But I'd left evidence behind. In the contractor's base camp, I'd set a delayed incendiary device. Nothing that would spread to the forest, but enough to destroy their research data, their equipment, their years of tracking information. The fire was ruled an electrical malfunction, but I knew they suspected me. I was arrested 2 days later. Federal charges: destruction of government property, obstruction of scientific research, interference with federal operations. They held me for 3 days in a facility in Seattle, questioned me repeatedly, threatened me with 20 years in prison. Then suddenly, I was released. All charges dropped. No explanation, no apology, just a warning delivered by Fletcher himself. "You've won this round, Hensley, but stay away from Sector 7. Stay away from the research areas. This is your last chance." I understood immediately why they'd let me go. They couldn't prosecute me without revealing Project Terminus in court, without explaining what they were really doing in Olympic National Park, without admitting that Bigfoot existed and they'd been hunting them for 30 years. I was 50 years old, forced into early retirement, under constant surveillance. But Guardian's family was safe, and 3 months later, hidden deep in wilderness where no human eyes could see, his mate gave birth to a healthy infant. Guardian brought the baby to show me one time, just once, when it was 2 weeks old. He approached the boundary of the park where I now watched from outside, no longer allowed to patrol the forest I'd protected for decades. The infant was tiny, maybe 10 pounds, with golden brown fur and eyes that hadn't fully opened yet. Guardian held his child with such careful tenderness, and I understood what he was saying. This life exists because of you. This future exists because you stood between us and extinction. I touched my hand to my heart, our old gesture. Guardian mirrored it. Then he disappeared back into the wilderness with his family, and I didn't see him again for 7 years. Retirement felt like exile. I bought a small cabin on the boundary of Olympic National Park, close enough to keep watch but outside the jurisdiction that had banned me from ranger work. My days became a routine of monitoring, documenting, waiting. I'd wake before dawn and hike to overlook points where I could observe the deep wilderness through binoculars. I knew Guardian's territory by heart, knew the patterns of his family's movement even from miles away. The years took their toll. By 2010, I had chronic back pain from decades of hiking rough terrain. My knees ached in cold weather. I'd been divorced twice, both women unable to compete with an obsession I couldn't explain. My daughter Sarah had given up trying to have a relationship with me. On her wedding day in 2008, I'd missed the ceremony because I'd spotted contractor vehicles near the park and spent the day tracking their movements instead. I lived alone with my journals, my photographs, my secrets. The locals thought I was crazy. The hermit who'd been a ranger once and couldn't let go. They weren't entirely wrong, but I kept watching. And over those years, I witnessed something beautiful. Guardian's infant grew into a healthy juvenile. I'd catch glimpses through my binoculars of the young one learning to forage, mimicking its parents' movements, playing in streams with the unself-conscious joy that transcends species. By 2015, that juvenile had reached adolescence, nearly 6 feet tall, beginning to establish independence while still staying close to family. Guardian himself was aging. I could see it in the way he moved, slower now, more careful. His fur had developed patches of silver, especially around his face and shoulders. He was probably in his 40s by my estimation, maybe older. For a species we barely understood, I had no idea what their lifespan might be. Then technology caught up with us. In 2015, consumer drones became widespread, and suddenly the skies weren't safe anymore. Hikers would fly them deep into the wilderness, capturing footage they'd post online within hours. I spent countless hours on social media, monitoring Bigfoot forums, searching for videos that might reveal Guardian's location. When I found legitimate footage, I'd work to discredit it, create fake accounts claiming I'd hoaxed the video myself, flood comment sections with disinformation, anything to muddy the waters. But the genuine sightings were increasing. Olympic National Park was becoming a hotspot for Bigfoot enthusiasts, and the pressure was building. I could feel it like a storm gathering on the horizon. Winter came hard in 2018. Heavy snows closed many of the park's roads and trails. I was in my cabin when I felt it, an instinct I couldn't name. Something was wrong. I'd learned over decades to trust these feelings. I packed emergency supplies and snowshoes and headed into the wilderness despite the weather warnings. It took me 2 days to find him. Guardian was lying in a small clearing, covered in a dusting of fresh snow. He wasn't moving. I approached slowly, my heart breaking with each step, already knowing what I'd find. He'd died peacefully from what I could tell. Old age, probably. His body was already cold, maybe a day gone. But what stopped me in my tracks was what surrounded him. His family had buried him according to their tradition. Stones carefully placed around his body in patterns I'd seen in that cave pictograph years ago. Fresh fir boughs laid across his chest. The female and the now adult offspring had performed funeral rites for him. I knelt in the snow next to the only real friend I'd ever had and wept like a child. This creature had trusted me when he had every reason to fear humans, had shown me his family, his history, his pain, had changed the entire trajectory of my life, and I hadn't even been there when he died. I reached into my pack and pulled out the compass I always carried. It had been a gift from my father, the one possession I valued above all others. I placed it carefully among the stones near Guardian's hand. He'd always been fascinated by it, the way the needle moved, pointing to the invisible north. It seemed right that he should have it now. I was leaving the clearing when I saw her, the female, guardian's mate, watching from the tree line with the adult offspring beside her. We looked at each other across the distance, and I saw grief in her eyes that mirrored my own. She made a soft sound, almost like a sigh, then turned and disappeared into the forest with her child. I hiked back to my cabin through a blur of tears and exhaustion, feeling every one of my 65 years. That night, I started coughing. At first, I thought it was just the cold air, the exertion of the hike, but the cough didn't go away. It got worse. By spring of 2019, I was diagnosed with stage 4 pancreatic cancer. The doctor gave me 6 months, maybe a year, with treatment. I declined most of it. I'd spent 30 years protecting the guardian's family. I didn't have time to spend my final months in chemotherapy. Instead, I used that time to prepare. I'd kept detailed journals for decades, thousands of pages documenting every encounter, every observation, every piece of evidence about Project Terminus. I'd collected photographs, copied government documents, and recorded GPS coordinates. All of it locked in a safe deposit box under false names, waiting. I also began noticing new activity in the park. Different contractors, different equipment, but the same old mission. They'd never stopped hunting. They just waited for me to become irrelevant, for age and sickness to remove the obstacle I represented. The technology had advanced beyond anything I could have imagined. Satellite thermal imaging that could track body heat through any canopy. AI-powered pattern recognition analyzing years of trail camera footage. DNA analysis from environmental samples. They were closing in, and I was too weak to stop them. In late 2019, Guardian's adult offspring appeared at my cabin. It was dusk, and I was sitting on my porch, too tired to do much else. The young one, now fully grown with its mother's reddish-brown fur and its father's massive build, emerged from the forest and approached to within 20 feet of my porch. We looked at each other, and I saw recognition there. This was the infant Guardian had shown me 16 years earlier. The child that existed because I'd stood between its family and capture. It had grown up hearing stories about me, learning to trust the strange human who left offerings and kept them safe. It made a series of soft vocalizations, then did something that shattered me. It placed its hand over its heart, Guardian's old gesture, then pointed at me. Thank you. Goodbye. It knew I was dying. Somehow, it understood. Maybe they could smell sickness the way animals can. Maybe it just saw how much I'd deteriorated since the last time we'd crossed paths. But it had come to say farewell. I stood, using my porch railing for support, and returned the gesture. Hand over heart. A promise kept, a friendship honored, a circle closing. The young one turned and vanished into the twilight, and I knew I'd never see any of them again. A week later, I received an envelope in my mailbox, no return address, expensive paper. Inside was a single typed page, an offer from a government agency with no official name. They knew about my journals, my documentation, my evidence. They'd been monitoring me for years, waiting. Now that I was dying, they wanted to make a deal. Full immunity for any crimes I'd committed. Restoration of my pension and benefits. Access to experimental cancer treatments that might extend my life. All I had to do was provide them with everything I knew. Maps of Guardian's territory, behavioral patterns, population estimates, the location of that hidden valley where the families gathered. They were offering me a few extra months of life in exchange for betraying everything I'd protected for 35 years. I walked outside, lit a match, and watched that letter burn in my fireplace. The flames turned it to ash in seconds, just like they'd turn my body to ash soon enough. Some things are worth dying for. Guardian had taught me that. He'd survived the murder of his first family, lived a decade alone with that trauma, then built a new life despite everything. He'd trusted one human when every instinct told him not to. He'd shown me what real courage looked like. I wasn't going to betray that trust now, not for anything they could offer me. I had maybe 6 months left, and I was going to use every single day to make sure Guardian's family stayed safe and hidden, even after I was gone. I'm back in the hospice bed now, Emma. You can hear it in my voice, the morphine making me drift, but I need to finish this while I still can. The recorder's been running for over an hour, and there's not much time left. The nurse says maybe a day, maybe 2, but you need to know where everything is hidden. You need to know what to do when I'm gone. Under the floorboards in my cabin, there's a waterproof case. Inside are 35 years of journals. Every encounter, every observation, every measurement and photograph. Coordinates for Guardian's territory, maps showing the hidden valley where the families gather. Documentation of Project Terminus that proves the government has known about Bigfoot since the 1970s. Evidence of capture operations, containment facilities, deaths in custody. Everything they've tried to keep secret for half a century. I've also included documentation of my crimes, the falsified reports, the destroyed equipment, the arson at that contractor camp in 2003. I'm confessing to all of it. Let them prosecute a dead man if they want. But more importantly, let the world know why I did it. Because here's what I learned, Emma. What Guardian taught me over those decades. Intelligence equals personhood. These beings aren't animals. They have language, families, culture, history. They teach their children, mourn their dead, create art, pass down knowledge through generations. They feel love and grief and fear the same way we do. They're people, just different from us. And for the last 50 years, our government has been hunting them like animals while denying they exist. Project Terminus has captured 23 Bigfoot since 1973. I found the complete records during my last infiltration of their systems in 2018, before I got too sick to hack anymore. 23 individuals taken from their families, and every single one died within 3 years. The reports call it failure to adapt, but I know what it really was. They died of broken hearts. They died of captivity. They chose death over living in cages, separated from everything they loved. The population I've been protecting might be the last truly wild group left in North America. Guardian's family, the other families in that hidden valley, maybe 30 to 40 individuals total. That's all that's left. And without protection, without someone standing between them and Project Terminus, they'll be extinct within a generation. I've set up legal protections as best I could. The evidence is held by 3 different law firms with instructions to release everything if I die under suspicious circumstances or if certain trigger events occur. Environmental groups will receive copies. Journalists I've vetted carefully. Even some sympathetic members of Congress, though God knows if they'll do anything. But the real protection, Emma, has to come from you now. From people who know the truth and choose to keep the secret while fighting the forces trying to destroy them. That's the balance I'm asking you to maintain. There's money too. An account in the Cayman Islands under a name I'll write down for you. It's not much, maybe $50,000, but I've been saving for years. Use it for legal defense when the truth comes out. Use it to fight Project Terminus in court. Use it however you need to continue this work. The night before I checked into hospice, I made one last trip to the boundary of the park. I could barely walk by then. Needed a cane just to make it to the tree line. I left an offering like I'd done for 35 years. Fresh salmon, apples, a jar of honey. But this time, I also left a letter, written in symbols and pictures because I don't know if they can read English. Images showing me leaving, not coming back. A drawing of them staying hidden, staying safe. My way of saying goodbye. The next morning, when my neighbor drove me to get hospice care, he mentioned seeing something strange near my cabin at dawn. Large footprints in the frost. Fresh ones leading right up to my porch and then away again. Something had left a pile of stones, arranged in that specific pattern I'd learned meant respect, remembrance, farewell. They knew. Guardian's family knew I was dying, and they came to say goodbye. Just like I'd said goodbye to them. Emma, I can hear you crying while you hold that recorder. I know this is hard to process. I know you probably think your grandfather lost his mind years ago, became obsessed with fantasy, wasted his life chasing myths. Maybe everyone will think that when this recording goes public. Maybe I'll be remembered as a crazy old man who threw away his career and family for delusion. But in that waterproof case under my cabin floor, you'll find proof. Photographs that can't be faked, not with 1990s technology. Plaster casts of footprints. Hair samples that don't match any known primate. Government documents with classification stamps. GPS data showing movement patterns that no human could make. Video footage from cameras I hid over the years, showing Guardian and his family in moments they didn't know they were being observed. You'll see them teaching their children to fish. You'll see them mourning at burial sites. You'll see Guardian touching that compass I left at his grave, examining it with wonder. You'll see proof of everything I've told you. And then you'll have to make the same choice I made 35 years ago. Do you follow the law, or do you follow what's right? Do you protect a system that's been committing slow genocide, or do you protect beings who deserve to exist in peace? I chose them. I chose Guardian and his family over my career, my marriages, my relationship with you and your mother. I chose them over my freedom, my health, my life. And lying here now, hours from death, I don't regret it. Not for a second. Because that infant Guardian showed me in 2003 as an adult now with children of their own. Because that hidden valley still holds families that laugh and play and live. Because somewhere in the deep wilderness of Olympic National Park, Bigfoot still exist. Still hide, still survive, and that's worth everything I sacrificed. The recorder's almost out of battery, Emma. My voice is fading. But I need you to promise me something. Take that evidence, use it wisely, fight Project Terminus. Tell the world the truth, but do it in a way that protects them, not exposes them. Find lawyers, scientists, ethicists who will fight for their rights without revealing their exact locations. And sometimes, when you can, leave offerings at the forest edge. Fresh salmon, apples, honey. They'll know what it means. They'll know that someone still remembers. That someone still protects them. That Guardian's trust in humanity wasn't completely misplaced. There's a sound outside my window right now. The nurse thinks it's just wind in the trees. But I know better. I can hear it. That low, resonant vocalization I first heard 35 years ago on a July afternoon when my life changed forever. They're out there in the tree line beyond the hospice parking lot. Guardian's family come to keep vigil for me the way I kept vigil for them all these years. Emma, turn off the recorder now. Take it home. Keep it safe. And when I'm gone, when you've had time to process everything, go to my cabin, find the evidence, make your choice. I'm tired now. The morphine is pulling me under and I'm ready. I'm ready to rest. I'm ready to be with Guardian again, wherever that might be. I kept my promise to him. I protected his family until my last breath. And now it's time to let go. Some secrets are worth dying for. Some beings are worth protecting, even at the cost of everything. Guardian taught me that, and I hope, somehow, my life taught the same lesson to you. Protect them, Emma. Please, they have no one else. The recording ends here. My grandfather, Robert Hensley, died 3 hours after speaking these words on November 12, 2024, at 3:47 in the morning. The nurse on duty reported that just before he passed, he smiled and reached toward the window, as if greeting someone only he could see. I found the waterproof case exactly where he said it would be. I've seen the evidence, the photographs, the journals, the government documents. Everything he claimed was true, and now I have to decide what to do with it. But first, I did what he asked. I drove to Olympic National Park last week, hiked to the coordinates he'd marked on the map, and I left offerings at the forest edge. Fresh salmon, apples, honey. Everything he'd taught me through that final recording. This morning, I went back. The food was gone, and in its place was a single stone, perfectly round, placed exactly where I'd left the salmon. Next to it, arranged in the frost, were pine cones in a pattern that looked almost deliberate, almost like a message. They're still there. Guardian's family is still alive, still hiding, still surviving. And now, like my grandfather before me, I'm the one standing between them and extinction. I don't know if I'm strong enough to do what he did. I don't know if I can sacrifice everything the way he sacrificed. But I know one thing for certain. Some secrets are worth keeping. Some beings are worth protecting. And my grandfather's 35 years of dedication can't end with his death. The work continues. The watch continues. And somewhere in the deep wilderness, a family that shouldn't exist keeps living, keeps hoping, keeps trusting that at least one human will keep them safe. I'm that human now, and I won't let them down.